People had a way of looking right through Ethan, not past him but through him, as if he were made of the same cold air that whistled down the December streets of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. At 16, Ethan had learned to carry invisibility like a second jacket, thin, insufficient, but better than nothing. His real jacket was patched at the elbows with fabric that didn't quite match, and his boots had cardboard inserts where the soles had worn through. The kind of poverty that makes you disappear wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, persistent, and it taught you to take up as little space as possible. Christmas lights strung across Main Street glowed warm and golden, but they weren't for families like his. They were for the people who walked past the storefronts with shopping bags, who laughed over hot chocolate at the cafe, who didn't have to choose between heating and eating. Ethan's family, his mother, his two younger sisters, and his grandfather, who could barely walk anymore, had been choosing for months now. This winter had been particularly cruel. The factory where his mother worked had cut hours. The disability check that kept them afloat came late more often than not. And hope, that fragile thing people talked about at Christmas, had become something they rationed more carefully than bread. When Ethan heard about the Christmas charity event at the community center, he didn't go expecting a miracle. He went because Mrs. Fletcher, who ran the food bank, had mentioned there would be a hot meal. And because being cold at home felt worse than being cold in a room full of strangers who could at least pretend to care. The community center was decorated with paper snowflakes and donated tinsel that had seen better decades. Families clustered around folding tables, eating donated ham and store-brand cookies. Ethan sat in the back, alone, making his plate last as long as possible. That's when they announced the raffle. "Ladies and gentlemen," called out Mr. Hendricks, the owner of Hendricks Feed and Supply, his voice booming with the forced cheer of someone performing charity. "We've got a special prize tonight, donated by the Callaway Ranch." A murmur went through the crowd. The Callaway Ranch was legendary in the county. Old money, championship bloodlines, the kind of place that bred cattle worth more than most people's houses. "It's a bull," Mr. Hendricks continued, gesturing toward the back door where a livestock trailer was visible through the window. "A genuine Callaway bull, folks. Now, I'll be honest, he's not championship stock. He's a bit unconventional, but he's healthy, he's strong, and someone here tonight is going to take him home." The crowd's excitement was tepid at best. Ethan heard whispers around him. Unconventional means worthless. Callaway's dumping their problems on charity cases. Who here can even keep a bull? This is a town event, not a ranch convention. Mr. Hendricks pulled names from a bucket with theatrical flair, calling out winners for various prizes, gift baskets, store credits, a refurbished bicycle that 3 kids immediately started fighting over. Ethan hadn't even realized he'd been entered until he heard his name. "Ethan Mercer." The room went quiet in that particular way rooms do when something uncomfortable happens. Ethan felt 24 pairs of eyes finally see him, really see him, for the first time that night. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the linoleum. "Come on up here, son," Mr. Hendricks called, waving him forward with aggressive enthusiasm. Ethan walked to the front, his face burning. When he reached the makeshift stage, Mr. Hendricks clapped him on the shoulder with a hand that felt more like ownership than congratulations. "Congratulations, young man. You've won yourself a bull." Someone in the crowd laughed, not cruelly, but with the kind of amusement people feel when the universe plays an obvious joke. A poor kid winning a bull. It was absurd. It was tragic. It was almost funny. Mr. Hendricks handed Ethan a piece of paper, some kind of certificate of ownership, and gestured toward the back door. "He's out in the trailer. We'll help you load him wherever you need him taken." I don't have anywhere for a bull," Ethan said quietly. Mr. Hendricks' smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Well, you'll figure something out. That's the spirit of Christmas, right? Making do with what you're given?" Ethan walked outside into the cold, holding the paper like it might dissolve. Behind the community center, a livestock trailer was parked under a flickering streetlight. A few men from the ranch were standing around, smoking and looking bored. One of them, a younger ranch hand with a Carhartt jacket and weathered hands, gestured to the trailer. "He's in there. Want to take a look before we move him?" Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. The ranch hand opened the trailer gate, and Ethan stepped inside. The bull stood in the center of the trailer, enormous and still. He was dark brown, almost black in the dim light, with a broad chest and horns that curved like questions. But it was his eyes that stopped Ethan cold. They weren't the eyes of an animal who'd been won in a raffle and dumped on charity. They were patient, knowing. The eyes of something that had been dismissed before and was waiting to see what kind of person stood in front of him now. Ethan stepped closer, slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. "They say you're worthless," Ethan whispered. "That you're too weak for breeding, too expensive to keep." The bull didn't move, just watched him with that same steady gaze. "People say the same about me," Ethan continued, surprised by his own voice. "They look right through me, like I'm not even here." Outside, he could hear the ranch hands talking, their voices low. "Poor kid. That thing's going to ruin him. Calloway's just dumping problems. Bull's got bad joints, can't breed, eats like a king and gives nothing back. Should have just sent him to auction." Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd heard those kinds of words before. About himself, about his family, about people who didn't fit into the neat categories of useful and valuable. The bull shifted slightly, and Ethan realized the animal was favoring his right rear leg. Not limping exactly, but careful. "Protecting something. You're hurt," Ethan said softly. The bull's ear flicked toward him, as if acknowledging the observation. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the cold seeping through his thin jacket, his breath clouding the air between them. Then he reached out slowly and placed his palm on the bull's shoulder. The animal was warm, solid, real. And for the first time in months, Ethan felt something settle in his chest that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite joy. It was deeper than both. It was recognition. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with you," Ethan admitted, "but I'm not going to let them throw you away." The bull's breathing was steady, calm, as if he'd been waiting a very long time for someone to say exactly that. When Ethan stepped out of the trailer, the ranch hands were stubbing out their cigarettes, ready to move on to the next task. "Where do you want him?" one of them asked, not unkindly. Ethan thought of his grandfather's house, the tiny backyard, the shed that was falling apart, the neighbors who already whispered about their family. "There's an old barn," Ethan said slowly, "about a mile from my house. It's abandoned. Could he stay there?" The ranch hand shrugged. "As long as there's shelter and you can get him food, sure. Not my problem where he ends up." They loaded the bull into a smaller trailer hitched to a pickup truck and drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook, past the Christmas lights that still weren't for families like Ethan's, past the houses with wreaths on their doors and the sound of laughter inside. When they reached the barn, a sagging structure that smelled of old hay and forgotten years, they unloaded the bull into what had once been a stall. "Good luck, kid," the ranch hand said, not sarcastically, just stating a fact. Luck was what Ethan would need. And then they were gone, and it was just Ethan and the bull in the cold darkness, snow beginning to fall in soft, silent flakes. The bull stood in the center of the stall, that same patient expression, as if he understood that this was just another chapter in a long story of being unwanted. Ethan sat down on an overturned bucket, exhausted, overwhelmed, and strangely not afraid. "I don't know your name," he said to the bull. "They didn't even tell me that." The bull shifted his weight, that careful movement again. Ethan thought of all the things people had called worthless, all the times he'd been invisible, all the ways the world had made it clear that some lives mattered and others didn't. "I'll call you Noble," Ethan decided, "because even when they say you're worthless, you still stand with dignity." The bull, Noble, exhaled slowly, a sound that might have been relief or might have been agreement. And in that moment, in a forgotten barn on the coldest night of the year, Ethan didn't know it yet, but he'd just made the decision that would change everything. Not because Noble was valuable, but because Ethan had chosen to see him anyway. The first night was the hardest. Ethan had no blankets for Noble, no proper feed, nothing but the thin layer of old hay scattered across the barn floor, and a desperate hope that the bull could survive until morning. He'd walked home through the snow, his mind racing with questions he had no answers for. How do you feed a bull when your family can barely feed itself? How do you care for an animal when you don't know the first thing about cattle? How do you keep something alive when everything in your life has taught you that survival is a luxury, not a guarantee? When Ethan slipped back into the house, a cramped rental with peeling wallpaper and a furnace that wheezed more than it heated, his mother was waiting in the kitchen. Clara Mercer sat at the table with a cup of tea she couldn't afford to refill, her face lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice flat with worry that had worn itself into resignation. "Christmas thing at the community center," Ethan said, not quite lying but not quite telling the truth either. His mother's eyes searched his face. She had a way of seeing through him that made Ethan feel both protected and exposed. "You're hiding something." Ethan sat down across from her, his hands folded on the table. "I won something, in a raffle." For a brief moment, Clara's face lifted with something that might have been hope. "What did you win?" "A bull." The hope died as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the kind of weary disbelief that comes from living in a world where even your luck is designed to hurt you. "A bull." "His name is Noble," Ethan said, as if that made any difference. Clara pressed her fingers to her temples. "Ethan, we can barely afford to heat this house. Your sisters are wearing shoes 2 sizes too small because I can't buy new ones until next month. Your grandfather needs medication we're rationing because the pharmacy won't give us credit anymore." She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed. "And you won a bull. I know it sounds like the universe is mocking us," Clara said, her voice cracking. "Like we're some kind of cosmic joke." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to explain the way Noble had looked at him, the recognition he'd felt, the promise he'd made. But the words felt too fragile for this kitchen, too naive for a woman who'd been fighting impossible battles for too long. "I'll figure it out," he said quietly. "I won't let him become our problem. I promise." His mother stood up, her chair scraping against the linoleum. She walked to the sink, her back to him, her shoulders curved with the weight of too many promises that couldn't be kept. "Your father used to say that too. I'll figure it out. Right up until he didn't." Ethan's father had left 3 years ago. Not dramatically, not with anger or goodbyes. He'd just stopped coming home one day, leaving behind debts and a family that learned to survive without him. "I'm not Dad," Ethan said, the words harder than he intended. Clara turned to look at him, and for a moment, Ethan saw something in her expression that broke his heart. Not anger, not disappointment. Just a deep, aching fear that her son was about to learn the same lesson his father had, that hope was expensive and they couldn't afford it. "No," she said softly. "You're not. You're better than he ever was. Which is why I'm terrified that this world is going to break you anyway." The next morning, Ethan woke before dawn and snuck out of the house with the last $20 from his hidden savings. Money he'd been putting aside from odd jobs, from returning bottles, from every small hustle a poor kid learns to survive. He walked to Hendrick's Feed and Supply, the only place open that early, and bought the cheapest bag of cattle feed they had. Mr. Hendricks was behind the counter, his cheerful charity persona replaced with the flat expression of a businessman dealing with inventory. When he saw Ethan, something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or pity. "You actually kept the bull?" Hendricks asked. "His name is Noble," Ethan said, placing the money on the counter. Hendricks rang up the feed, then paused. He reached under the counter and pulled out a worn pamphlet titled Basic Cattle Care for Beginners. He slid it across to Ethan without comment. "Thank you," Ethan said. Hendricks just nodded, his expression unreadable. "That feed will last maybe 3 days if you're lucky. Bull that size needs about 30 pounds a day plus hay. You do the math." Ethan did the math. It was impossible. But he took the bag anyway. When he got to the barn, Noble was standing in the same spot Ethan had left him, patient and still. The bull's eyes tracked Ethan as he entered, and for a moment, Ethan felt the weight of that gaze. The trust, the expectation, the quiet question of whether this human would be different from all the others. I brought food, Ethan said, tearing open the bag and pouring it into a rusted trough he'd found in the corner. It's not much, but it's something. Noble moved toward the trough with that same careful gait, favoring his right leg. He ate slowly, deliberately, and Ethan watched, noting the way the bull's joints seemed stiff, the way he shifted his weight to avoid putting too much pressure on that leg. Ethan pulled out the pamphlet Mr. Hendricks had given him and started reading. Most of it was about feeding schedules, pasture management, vaccination protocols, things that required money and resources Ethan didn't have. But there was a section on common health issues, and when Ethan reached the part about joint inflammation and arthritis in older cattle, everything clicked into place. Noble wasn't weak, he wasn't useless, he was in pain. And the Callaway Ranch, with all their money and expertise, had looked at a bull in pain and decided he wasn't worth helping. They donated him to charity like he was trash, like his suffering was someone else's problem now. Ethan felt something hot and sharp rise in his chest. Not quite anger, but close. A fierce, protective determination that surprised him with its intensity. They gave up on you, Ethan said, standing up and moving closer to Noble. They looked at you and decided you weren't worth the effort, that your pain made you worthless. Noble stopped eating and turned his head to look at Ethan, those dark, knowing eyes steady and calm. But pain doesn't make you worthless, Ethan continued, his voice stronger now. It just makes you someone who needs help. He thought of his mother, her exhaustion and fear, his sisters, wearing shoes that hurt their feet, his grandfather, rationing medication because they couldn't afford to fill the prescription. All of them in pain in different ways. All of them dismissed by a world that only valued people who didn't require effort. I'm going to help you, Ethan said, placing his hand on Noble's neck. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to figure it out. Noble's breathing was steady, warm against Ethan's palm. And in the cold December morning, in a barn that smelled of old hay and forgotten years, Ethan made a decision that went beyond the bull standing in front of him. He was going to prove that worthless wasn't real, that it was just a word people used when they didn't want to look close enough to see the truth. And if he could prove it for Noble, maybe, just maybe, he could prove it for his family too. Ethan spent the next 3 days learning everything he could about arthritis in cattle. He couldn't afford a veterinarian, couldn't afford proper medication, couldn't afford anything the pamphlet recommended. But what he could afford was time, attention, and a stubborn refusal to accept that Noble's pain was permanent. He started with warmth. Every morning before school, Ethan would arrive at the barn with blankets he'd gathered, old ones from home, donated ones from the church thrift store, even a horse blanket someone had thrown away. He draped them over Noble's back and legs, helping retain body heat that eased the stiffness in the bull's joints. Then came movement. The pamphlet mentioned that gentle exercise could help, so Ethan began walking Noble around the small clearing behind the barn. At first, the bull moved reluctantly, each step careful and measured. But slowly, day by day, the walks grew longer. Noble's gait became steadier. The trust between them deepened. Word began to spread through Millbrook in the way small towns spread news, quietly, through whispers and glances, through people who noticed the poor kid walking a massive bull through the snow at dawn. Mrs. Fletcher from the food bank was the first to visit. She brought a bag of carrots and apples, claiming they were extras from a delivery, though Ethan suspected she'd bought them herself. Heard you won yourself some trouble at the raffle, she said, watching Noble eat the apple slices from Ethan's hand with surprising gentleness. His name is Noble, Ethan replied, the phrase becoming a mantra. And he's not trouble. He's just misunderstood. Mrs. Fletcher studied the bull, then studied Ethan. You know what you're doing? No, Ethan admitted, but I'm learning. She smiled, sad and knowing. That's all any of us can do, I suppose. By the end of the week, something remarkable had happened. Noble was moving better. Not perfect, not healed, but better. The constant warmth, the gentle exercise, the steady care, it was working. And Ethan, who'd spent his whole life being told he couldn't fix anything, was discovering that sometimes the most important solutions were the ones that didn't require money. They just required someone who refused to look away. One evening, as Christmas approached and snow fell softly on Millbrook, Ethan sat with Noble in the barn, watching the bull rest more comfortably than he had the night they'd met. "You're getting better," Ethan said quietly. "People are starting to notice." Noble's ear flicked toward him, and Ethan thought about what Mrs. Fletcher had said. That he was learning. That maybe that was enough. But deep down, Ethan knew the real test was still coming. Because making Noble comfortable was one thing. Proving he had value, real value that people would recognize, that was something else entirely. And winter in Millbrook was long. The feed wouldn't last forever. Neither would borrowed blankets and donated carrots. Ethan needed more than temporary solutions. He needed something that would change everything. He just didn't know what it was yet. The answer came from an unexpected place. 3 days before Christmas, a truck pulled up to the barn. Expensive, clean, out of place in this forgotten corner of Millbrook. A woman stepped out, probably in her 50s, wearing a coat that cost more than Ethan's family paid in rent. "You're the boy with the Callaway bull?" she asked. Ethan stood protectively in front of Noble's stall. "His name is Noble, and yes." The woman's expression softened. "I'm Dr. Sarah Brennan. I run an agricultural genetics research program at Penn State. I heard about you through Mrs. Fletcher." She stepped closer, her eyes moving over Noble with the practiced assessment of someone who knew cattle. "May I examine him?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Dr. Brennan spent 20 minutes checking Noble, his joints, his build, his temperament. The bull stood calmly through it all, as if he understood this was important. Finally, she straightened up and looked at Ethan with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Do you know why the Callaway Ranch donated this bull to charity?" "They said he was worthless, too weak to breed, too expensive to keep." Dr. Brennan shook her head slowly. "That's not the whole truth. This bull isn't from their current breeding program. He's from an older bloodline, one they abandoned 15 years ago because it didn't produce the massive, aggressive bulls the rodeo circuit wanted." She placed her hand on Noble's shoulder. "But what they didn't realize is that this bloodline has something far more valuable. The genetics for calm temperament, disease resistance, and longevity. We've been tracking it for years and we thought it was lost." Ethan's heart was pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this worthless bull is carrying genetics that could revolutionize sustainable cattle farming. His offspring would be perfect for small farms, for organic operations, for families who can't afford veterinary emergencies every season." She looked at Ethan directly. "He's not weak. He's exactly what the future needs. But his arthritis, manageable, treatable. I can provide medication and a care plan." Dr. Brennan pulled out a card. "I'd like to include Noble in our breeding program. We'd cover all his care, provide a proper facility, and pay you a consultation fee of $5,000 initially, with royalties on any offspring." $5,000. It was more money than Ethan had ever imagined having, but as he looked at Noble, standing calm and dignified in the cold barn, he thought about everything they'd been through. The first night, the walks through the snow, the way people had dismissed them both as worthless. "I need to think about it," Ethan said quietly. Dr. Brennan smiled. "That's exactly the answer I was hoping for. It means you actually care about him." She handed him the card. "Call me when you're ready. But Ethan, you already proved he has value. Now it's time to prove that you do too." After she left, Ethan sat with Noble in the gathering darkness, his mind racing. He'd done it. He'd proven that worthless was just a word. That Noble had value all along, hidden beneath pain and dismissal. But accepting Dr. Brennan's offer meant letting Noble go. It meant trusting someone else to care for him. It meant choosing his family's needs over his own attachment. It meant growing up. Christmas morning came quietly to the Mercer house. Ethan woke early and made the call. Dr. Brennan answered on the second ring, and 30 minutes later, the arrangements were made. Noble would go to Penn State after the new year. The $5,000 would arrive before then. When Ethan told his mother, Clara didn't cry. She just pulled him close and held him for a long time, her hands shaking against his back. "You did something impossible," she whispered. "You took something everyone called worthless and proved them all wrong." "Noble did that," Ethan said. "I just refused to give up on him." His mother pulled back, looking at him with red-rimmed eyes. No, you both did it. Together. That afternoon, Ethan brought his family to the barn. His sisters, 10-year-old Maya and 8-year-old Sophie, approached Noble carefully, their eyes wide with wonder. His grandfather, leaning heavily on his cane, stood in the doorway and smiled the first real smile Ethan had seen in months. "He's beautiful," Maya whispered, reaching out to touch Noble's neck. The bull stood perfectly still, patient and gentle, as if he understood these were the people Ethan had been fighting for all along. Clara stood beside Ethan, watching her children laugh for the first time in weeks. "What you did? It wasn't just about the money, was it?" "No," Ethan said quietly. "It was about proving that being broken doesn't mean being worthless, that needing help doesn't make you less valuable." He looked at his mother. "That's true for bulls, and it's true for us too." On New Year's Day, Dr. Brennan's team came for Noble. Ethan walked him to the trailer one last time, his hand resting on the bull's shoulder. "You're going somewhere better now," Ethan said. "Somewhere they'll see you the way I do." Noble turned his head, those dark eyes meeting Ethan's, and in that moment, Ethan understood something profound. He hadn't saved Noble. They'd saved each other. The check arrived 3 days later. Clara used it to pay off debts, buy medication, get the girls proper shoes. But she also did something else. She framed the raffle ticket and hung it in the kitchen. "So we remember," she told Ethan, "that sometimes the things that look like burdens are actually gifts. We just have to be brave enough to see them." Ethan visited Noble at Penn State that spring. The bull was thriving in a proper facility, surrounded by people who understood his value. When Ethan approached, Noble walked to the fence immediately, pressing his head against Ethan's chest the way he had that first night in the cold barn. "You changed everything," Ethan whispered. "You changed my whole family." But as he looked into Noble's calm, knowing eyes, Ethan realized the truth. Noble hadn't changed anything. He'd simply been himself, patient, dignified, and waiting for someone to see past the labels to what was really there. And in teaching Ethan to see him, Noble had taught him to see everything differently. The rejected son and the worthless bull had both found something better than value in a world that tried to discard them. They'd found proof that being seen was worth more than being perfect, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the things nobody else wanted. A rejected son won a worthless bull in a Christmas charity raffle, and it changed his family forever.